There are stories that never made the history books. Whispers tucked behind velvet curtains. Names that were never written down. And if you wandered the streets of New York in 1870, just after the gas lamps flickered on and the respectable folk drew their curtains closed, you might have stumbled past one of them, without even knowing it. Not all the city's secrets wore corsets and rouge. Some wore pressed waistcoats and pomade. Some answered the door with a half smile and a soft voice. And some, if you knew who to ask, could be visited for an hour, a touch, or something far more complicated. Most people didn't speak about male prostitutes. Not in church, not in newspapers, not in daylight, but they existed, tucked behind euphemisms like hairdresser or companion. They worked in boarding houses, walk-up apartments, and rented rooms above millinery shops. And some of them, according to hushed reports and scandalized reformers, slept with 20 women a day. Not men, not sailors, women, married ones, lonely ones, curious ones. Their stories weren't supposed to survive, but a few fragments did, hidden in vice reports, court ledgers, old letters smudged with perfume. What they reveal is strange and sad and oddly human. A version of 1870s America where desire didn't follow the rules, and where the rules didn't always win. It is here, in this soft and flickering world of whispered appointments and gaslit bedrooms, that our story begins. By the time the sun dipped behind the soot-stained rooftops, the city began to shift. Market stalls closed. Children were called indoors. Horses clopped more slowly down the cobbled streets. But in certain neighborhoods, usually just off the main roads, where signs hung crooked and lamplight pooled on brick, the real business of the night was just beginning. This was not the raucous world of brothels filled with piano music and sailors. This was something quieter, stranger, often richer. Behind plain curtains and carefully worded advertisements, certain homes opened their doors to a very specific clientele. The men who lived or worked there were usually young, immaculately dressed, unmarried. They were sometimes described as kept or taken in by older women, widows, mostly. Or they rented single rooms in boarding houses known for their discretion. No one used the word prostitute. Instead, their occupations were listed as assistant, host, musician, or even hairdresser. These weren't lies so much as they were permissions. City inspectors rarely disturbed these homes. But once in a while, a moral reformer would sneak in behind the scenes and write what they saw. One such report, from 1872, described a young man named T.L. who was of uncommon beauty, with a calm demeanor and European manner of dress. He reportedly saw up to 20 women in a single Saturday. The names of the women were never recorded. The initials of the man were all that survived. Whether or not the number was true, the rumor spread. It wasn't about the exact count. It was about the possibility that somewhere in this vast, growing city, a man could spend his days entirely at the service of women, and they would pay for the privilege. Some clients came alone. Others arrived in pairs, pretending to visit a sewing circle or spiritualist. They paid in cash, often wrapped in handkerchiefs. Most of the time, they came during the day, when their husbands were at work and the streets were less suspicious. If someone noticed, they rarely said anything. It wasn't always about sex. Some wanted compliments, attention, or the feeling of being desired. Others wanted to be told they were beautiful, even when they no longer believed it. The stallions, as some whispered, were careful, discreet, and patient. They offered something that husbands and suitors sometimes forgot: gentleness. Not all of them worked alone. Some were managed by madams, older women who scheduled appointments and screened clients. These women kept ledgers, charged by the hour, and knew exactly what they were doing. They stocked their homes with lavender water, soft linens, and good lighting. They arranged quiet exits and offered tea at the door. Male prostitution didn't appear in sermons or editorials, but it existed, quietly, persistently, and often it was hiding in plain sight. In 1870, New York streets were noisy, busy, and watched, but only sometimes. Watchmen knew where to look, and just as importantly, they knew where not to look. There were districts filled with honky-tonk saloons and penny broadsheets that thrived on scandal. But a few blocks over, in neighborhoods where the curtains were thicker and the houses sat close together, something more delicate was happening. Male prostitution, though never called that, functioned not in the open but in the in-between. It survived on silence, discretion, and reputation. Those who participated knew the rules. Clients didn't gossip. Workers didn't speak out. And the city, for the most part, chose to look away. For many of the men involved, survival depended on language. They used coded phrases, polite terms, and careful professions that could mean one thing or another depending on who was listening. A companion to ladies, for example, might just as easily have been a carriage driver, or something else entirely. A private instructor in etiquette could, with a right glint in the eye, be a lover by appointment. Some called themselves valets. Others used the word attendant. Sometimes, they were introduced at social events as cousins, distant relations, or renters in the upper room. These explanations weren't meant to fool everyone. They were meant to provide just enough of a shield to avoid direct confrontation. Everyone played along. Everyone stayed polite. Clients often came from the upper rungs of society. Married women, rich widows, even the wives of clergy. These were not desperate women, but rather bored ones. Women with money, time, and the intelligence to know they would never be offered affection freely. Not at their age, not in their position. Some had married for social status. Others had lost the only man who ever truly cared for them. Some had simply grown tired of being invisible. What they wanted wasn't always lustful. Sometimes it was more complicated. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to feel interesting. And for that, they were willing to pay. The stallions, as they were quietly called, were expected to memorize names, show interest in stories, and offer compliments that sounded sincere. If they remembered a favorite flower or asked after a sick mother-in-law, it was not by accident. These were men who knew the value of making someone feel desired, especially when the world had decided they no longer were. In New Orleans, some men operated out of grand, fading houses left over from the Creole aristocracy. In San Francisco, they worked above barbershops or in rented rooms in Chinatown, where the city's prejudice made it easier to hide. In Chicago, entire buildings were rumored to serve as rotating salons for private evening visits. Protection came not from law enforcement, but from relationships. Some stallions were shielded by wealthy clients. Others were protected by madams who had deep pockets and deeper connections. One former dancer in St. Louis reportedly managed half a dozen male workers and kept a judge on her monthly thank you list. She claimed she never once had to bribe a policeman, because the police was some of my best customers. Of course, discretion was fragile. When scandals did break, the press covered them in euphemisms so thick you could barely tell what had happened. A man of improper occupation caught consorting with ladies of means might be fined for vagrancy or loitering with lewd intent, a charge that meant nothing and everything at once. But even then, few names were printed. It wasn't just about protecting the men. It was about protecting the women. If a scandal hinted too clearly at female desire, especially desire that broke the rules, it was quickly smoothed over or quietly removed. Even court records would be altered after the fact. A man once charged with soliciting in Albany had his case file updated a week later. His offense was rewritten as misuse of parlor furniture. No one explained what that meant. Despite the risk, some of these men did remarkably well. A few saved enough to open legitimate businesses. Others fell in love with clients and disappeared into their households, officially rebranded as servants or house secretaries. And some simply vanished, moved to another city, changed their names, started again. Still, their presence remained. Behind every polite boarding house and every laced-up drawing room was the possibility of something unsaid, something paid for in cash, something that smelled faintly of cologne and lavender water, but never left a trace on paper. And as long as people were lonely, the city made room for them. They said they wanted to purify the city, sweep out the filth, clean up the streets. But the reformers of 1870 were a strange breed. Clutching their leather notebooks and pearl-handled pens, they roamed the slums and parlor districts in high boots and tall collars, documenting vice like collectors chasing rare birds. And behind their moral speeches and trembling indignation, there was something else. Curiosity, obsession, even. They knew about the women who sold sex. That much was already a well-trodden topic in sermons and pamphlets. But the men, the idea that women, respectable women, might go looking for pleasure on their own terms, that was harder to talk about. And yet, the evidence was there, scribbled in the margins of private ledgers, or coded into the back pages of vice reports that were never published. One reform agent in New York, name withheld, but clearly someone with access, described young males of feminine grace who entertain older ladies with what can only be described as impropriety in installments. He called them parlor stallions, and claimed to have seen 3 such houses on a single block in the East Village. His tone shifted, though, halfway through his report. The horror melted. What was left felt almost like admiration. Reformers were drawn to these houses, not always as observers, sometimes as clients. They often used the language of disease. They didn't say desire. They said corruption. They didn't say loneliness. They said decay. And yet they described the men in such detail. His cheekbones, his gloves, the smell of his hair pomade, that the lines between critique and craving blurred. Some reports read more like love letters than warnings. One reformer who traveled from Chicago to Philadelphia in 1873 wrote that he was shocked to discover a salon operated by gentlemen of extraordinary charm, where afternoon tea was served by candlelight and ladies arrived without shame, often laughing and embracing one another on the stair. He went back the next day, then the next. His final journal entry simply read, "I fear I am compromised." Most of these reports were never published. The respectable newspapers had no appetite for male scandal. Stories of brothels filled with women were lurid and safe to print. But houses full of men, especially ones servicing society women, that would upset the order of things. It wasn't just indecent, it was unbelievable. Or rather, it had to pretend to be. Still, rumors leaked. A joke told at a men's club. A whisper passed in a milliner's shop. Some husbands claimed to have heard of such houses but dismissed them as continental nonsense, a reference to Paris, where male sex work was more openly tolerated. Others scoffed at the idea that women would ever pay for such things. A lady, one man said in a letter to the editor, knows her place. But not every lady agreed. In one rare interview collected by a reform group in Boston, a widow, anonymous, aged 43, admitted she had been in the care of a gentleman attendant for 5 years. "I am not ashamed," she said. "He brings me flowers. He makes me feel something." The transcriber underlined that sentence twice and added a note in the margin, "not usable." What kept them running was not greed, but demand. And the reformers, for all their fire and fury, never shut them down entirely. They cracked windows. They made arrests. They issued warnings. But the business adapted. It changed names, shifted hours. It outlasted every clipboard and pamphlet. Because people, no matter how rigid the world around them, still wanted to be touched, still wanted to be noticed, still wanted to feel alive, even if only for 20 minutes behind a closed door. He might have started as a messenger boy, or a street violinist with holes in his gloves. He might have grown up polishing boots in hotel lobbies, watching how gentlemen walked and how ladies laughed behind lace gloves. Many stallions, if anyone had cared enough to ask, came from the spaces in between. They weren't always poor, but they were always untethered. Boys who had drifted to the city without a trade. Sons of disgraced families. Young men who preferred silence to obedience. And often, they had something that couldn't be measured. A particular softness in the voice, a glint in the eye, a way of standing that invited attention. No one filled out a job application. You were chosen, or you stumbled in. Some were invited by women already deep in the circuit. Older widows or housekeepers who had seen them loitering by a cafe window, noticed the careful grooming, the fitted coat. Others arrived through referral. Whispered introductions passed between clients and madams. "I know someone you might like." A gentleman, a good listener. And then, slowly, he would be folded into the rhythm of things. There was a kind of training. It wasn't formal, but it was real. A young man might be taught how to brew tea properly. how to pour a glass of port without spilling, how to compliment a woman's earrings as though it were the first time he'd ever seen jewels. The goal wasn't seduction, it was attention, focus, precision. Many of these men were called gentlemen not for their wealth, but for their performance of civility. They were expected to know how to dance, how to quote Byron or Keats if asked. They didn't have to be educated, but they had to be convincing. The work wasn't all glamour. It was grueling. You had to be charming even when your feet ached and your eyes were burning. You had to laugh at the right moments and not at the right stories, even if you'd heard them 10 times before. You had to remember names, faces, birthdays, and sometimes you had to pretend it wasn't about money. One former stallion, known only by his diary initials, HS, wrote in 1876, "I do not sell myself. I sell the idea that I belong to no one." He worked out of a townhouse in Baltimore, kept neat by a housemaid who spoke very little. His clients were women of sorrow and silk, as he put it. His job, he said, was to make them forget. Others weren't so philosophical. Some did it for the money, plain and simple. It paid better than factory work. It paid better than coaching or printing or tailoring. And for a few, especially those with no family, no trade, and no respectable path forward, it was the only job that came with its own room and meals. There was risk, always. Getting caught might mean jail. Or worse, exposure. Your name in the paper. A family letter returned unopened. For those with male clients, the danger doubled. Sodomy laws were brutal. A single accusation, real or false, could destroy you. Still, many stayed. Some because they learned to love the work. Not the intimacy, necessarily, but the ritual of it. The clean linen, the careful lighting, the quiet hush of a room before a knock at the door. Others stayed because they had nowhere else to go. A few became legends. In New Orleans, there was a man called Rue who worked only for Creole widows. He wore gloves at all times, even indoors, and was said to speak 4 languages. In New York, a stallion known as the secretary operated from the back of a law office, charming wives of junior politicians and well-to-do bankers. In Chicago, Locke was so popular that his appointments were booked out 2 months in advance, and women reportedly sent him poetry by mail, addressed only with initials and an embroidered handkerchief. No photographs exist. No birth records can be traced. These men drifted through the cracks of history like smoke. But they were real. They were desired. And some of them, for a while at least, were free, freer than most men dared to be, because they belonged to no one. Except, of course, for the next knock at the door. They came in silence, some with lace gloves, others with parasols tucked under their arms, even on cloudy days. Most wore rings, all wore secrets. No one spoke their names. The women who visited stallions did not belong to one class or type. Some were widows, wealthy and restless, left behind by men who had died in war or rail accidents or behind the closed doors of whiskey-soaked clubs. Others were young wives, newly married, already disillusioned. Some came from scandal, others simply from boredom. Society taught them to be still, to be modest, to be grateful. But desire has a way of leaking through the cracks, even in the most finely kept drawing rooms. They were told that men needed sex, but women needed restraint. That a woman who hungered was ill, sinful, or simply hysterical. Yet here they were, draped in satin and shame, slipping coins into gloved hands and pretending they were visiting an old friend. Some justified it with stories. The stallion reminded them of someone they once loved, or he offered what their husbands refused to give. Others explained it as therapy, something to soothe their nerves, like a steam bath or smelling salts. One woman, in a letter never meant to be sent, wrote, "He does not hurt me when he touches me." I did not know that was allowed. They arrived at odd hours, mid-morning, while the housemaid was out for milk. Late afternoon, just before supper. They never stayed long. Some brought gifts, ribbons, cakes, books of poetry. Others brought nothing but silence. Many came only once. Others returned weekly. A few never stopped, and they weren't always sure how to feel. There was guilt, yes, that had been stitched into them from birth. But there was also a strange sort of power, the quiet thrill of making a choice. For many, it was the first time they had ever paid for something they wanted and gotten exactly that. They didn't talk to one another, not openly, but sometimes, in parlors and sewing circles, they dropped hints. A raised eyebrow, a knowing look, the faintest trace of perfume they didn't wear themselves. Their husbands, for the most part, had no idea, or pretended not to. Some were too busy to notice. Some were doing the same thing, with mistresses, actresses, dancers. Others had grown so accustomed to distance in their marriages that a new silence made no difference. Of course, not every woman who visited a stallion was free to do so. Some came in fear, others in secrecy so complete that they nearly vanished. One journal from 1871, unsigned, hidden behind the false back of music box, contained this line: "I feel more myself in his company than anywhere else, and I hate myself for it." Religion offered no comfort. In fact, it often made the shame worse. Sermons railed against unfaithful wives and women who betray their station, though rarely with specifics. The implication was clear. Women who strayed did so at the cost of their souls. But the truth was quieter, sadder. These women were not trying to destroy their families. They were trying to feel something, anything, before the shutters closed forever. A few were caught. When it happened, the fallout was swift. Women were sent to rest homes for moral treatment. Some were institutionalized. A few disappeared entirely from public life, erased from society's records like misspelled words. Their names appeared only in funeral notices years later, simple, clean, and deeply incomplete. And yet, despite the risks, they kept going. Why? Because for some, the stallions offered more than pleasure. They offered presence, a moment of attention, a break in the drudgery. One woman described it as being looked at like I matter. For her, that was worth more than the silver coin she slipped beneath the teacup. It wasn't just lust. It was rebellion. Small, soft, almost invisible, but real. The world had told these women that their value ended after marriage, after childbirth, after beauty faded. The stallions, for all their artifice, offered something else. Not forever, not even for the night, but for a moment, a reflection of who they used to be, or who they still hoped they were. And sometimes, that was enough. By the 1880s, the stallions were still there, but they were harder to find. The great cities of America were changing. New York had grown taller, louder, faster. Chicago was rebuilding after the fire. San Francisco had filled its hills with gaslight and telegram wires. Everywhere, the country seemed to be moving forward, laying down tracks and inventing new ways to forget the past. But in the cracks, the trade endured. In New Orleans, it took on a French flavor, mirroring the maisons closes of Paris. Appointments were made through coded letters, left at perfumeries or bookshops. In Charleston, it moved behind parlor doors, disguised as piano lessons or etiquette tutoring. In Washington, D.C., where scandal and diplomacy always danced together, stallions became a quiet part of the cost of influence. That was how one senator's mistress described it, a quiet cost. In smaller cities, the practice went underground. Literally, in some cases. A building in Cincinnati was discovered in the 1920s with 2 entire basement rooms, long sealed, lined with faded wallpaper and faint perfume. No names, no records, just silence. What had once been whispered from mouth to mouth now became encoded in gesture and routine. A boarding house that offered daily laundry but no visible washroom. A man who paid rent but never appeared to work. A woman who received flowers every Thursday, delivered by hand. It was in the spaces between facts that the truth survived. By now, few people used the term stallion. It had slipped out of favor, too vulgar, too obvious. Instead, these men were now companions, attendants, roomers with charm. The language softened as the work hardened. Technology began to interfere. The telephone made appointments quicker but riskier. The camera made exposure more dangerous. Print was everywhere, and a slip of the tongue could find its way into a gossip column faster than anyone expected. Caution, once optional, became essential. And so the profession became even more discreet. The madams adapted, as they always had. Some moved into more respectable work. Boarding house owners, dressmakers, importers of French soaps. But behind the storefront, the old patterns remained. Certain doors still opened after dusk. Certain men still greeted visitors with the same tailored calm and polite detachment that had defined the work for decades. And yet, despite its survival, the stallions began to disappear from the official story. They left no monuments, no memoirs, no romanticized novels with tragic endings. Their names were misspelled, or never written at all. The women they served rarely spoke of them. The men who tolerated their presence were eager to forget. Even the reformers, so vocal in earlier years, turned their attention to other causes. What remains are fragments. A letter in the margin of a court transcript. A diary entry with names smudged out. A business card with only initials and a time of day. In rare cases, photographs, stiff, posed, and unlabeled. Men in crisp waistcoats, looking into the camera like they know something you don't. And then there are the rumors. In Boston, they say a certain cobbler shop used to be a front for a gentleman's parlor. In Philadelphia, old families speak in half-jokes about great-grandmothers who traveled often and kept a companion in the city. In Baltimore, the walls of a demolished hotel were found to have dozens of love notes wedged behind the baseboards, every one addressed to the same man, simply R. No one knows what became of him. Some stallions likely married, quietly folded into ordinary lives. Others may have continued the work under new guises. And some vanished completely, burned away by scandal, or sickness, or the slow erosion of a world that never planned to remember them. But even if they are gone, their impact lingers. They changed how some women understood power. They offered comfort, agency, rebellion, even if only briefly. And in doing so, they carved a quiet space into American history, one without headlines or statues, but real, nonetheless. Because history isn't just what's recorded, it's what's remembered in secret. And sometimes, the most fascinating stories are the ones that were never meant to be told at all. There's a reason this story doesn't appear in textbooks. It isn't because it didn't happen. It isn't because it wasn't common. It's because it never fit. The idea of women paying for pleasure, and men selling it in silence, unsettled a country built on a very specific kind of order. One where men desired, and women endured. Where homes were sacred, and shame belonged only to the poor. Where sex was whispered, but always presumed to be a one-way street. The stallions broke that model. They weren't revolutionaries, not on purpose. They weren't activists or philosophers. They were workers, lovers, performers, listeners. They played a role that the world didn't want to admit existed, and they played it well enough to be remembered, but only by those who weren't supposed to speak. And so their story frayed at the edges. They vanished from the archives, replaced by euphemism and metaphor. The women who visited them took their secrets to the grave. The reformers moved on to new sins. The cities grew taller, brighter, noisier. Whole neighborhoods were torn down. Boarding houses became apartment buildings. Parlors became parking lots. But not everything disappears. A cent in a second-hand book. A photograph tucked into the binding of a family Bible. A folded letter written in looping script, never sent. These are the places history hides the things it can't process. The fragments. And somewhere, in those fragments, the truth flickers on. We don't know what happened to the man who reportedly slept with 20 women in a single day. Was he real? Was the number exaggerated? Probably. But the story was passed along, remembered, if not verified. And that alone means something. It means someone noticed. Someone counted. Not because they wanted to shame him, but because they couldn't believe it. Couldn't understand how such a thing could exist in their world. So hidden, yet so alive. A quiet current beneath the surface of respectable life. And that disbelief, that refusal to say his name aloud, that was the real reason he vanished. He, and all those like him, did not fit the story America wanted to tell about itself. But still, for a time, they were there. In rented rooms above quiet shops. In brownstones with crooked stairs. In perfume-scented parlors that smelled faintly of steam and dust. waiting, working, listening. And for the women who found them, they were more than just a service. They were escape. They were attention. They were the first mirror that didn't distort or ignore. Even now, you can feel them in the silence between written things. The missing names in the census. The occupations that don't quite explain themselves. The widow who never remarried, but always smiled a little too knowingly when asked why. The stallions of 1870 have faded from view, but not from meaning. They remind us that history is full of people who weren't supposed to matter. People who were touched, paid, desired, forgotten. People who shaped the lives of others not through fame or politics, but through presence, through affection, through the quiet, radical act of being what someone needed. They belong to no one, which is why, even now, they belong to everyone. And somewhere, in the corners of the story, they are still waiting, half lit by gaslight, smiling faintly, and ready to vanish again as soon as the curtain falls.